For 40 years, she thought no one would find her. She was wrong. If you want more real-life cases like this, subscribe now. The next story is even more shocking. She disappeared without a trace. No warning, no goodbye. One day she was there, the next, gone. At first, it didn't seem like a crime. Just a woman leaving town. It happens all the time. People move. People start over. People disappear by choice. But this wasn't like that. Because she didn't just leave. She erased herself. No forwarding address. No contact with family. No activity under her name. Nothing. And that's what made it strange. Because people who leave still exist somewhere. But she didn't. It was as if she had vanished completely. The last confirmed sighting was ordinary. Almost forgettable. A small town. Late afternoon. She was seen walking out of a local store. Calm. Normal. No signs of stress. No urgency. Nothing that suggested what was about to happen. And then, she was gone. When people realized she hadn't been seen for days, questions started. At first, they assumed she had traveled, visited someone, taken time away. But as days turned into weeks, that explanation stopped making sense. Her home was still there, untouched. No signs of packing. No missing belongings. Everything was exactly where it should be. Except for one thing. Her. That's when concern turned into something else. Suspicion. Because leaving without taking anything isn't normal. It suggests something happened. Something sudden. Something unexpected. Authorities were notified. A missing person case was opened. Investigators began with the basics. Friends, family, co-workers, anyone who might know where she went. But no one had answers. No one knew anything. And that was the problem. Because someone always knows something. But in this case, there was nothing. No argument before she left. No signs of trouble. No reason to disappear. Just a clean break. Too clean. Investigators searched her home carefully, looking for anything out of place. Anything that might explain what happened. And at first, they found nothing. No signs of struggle. No forced entry. Everything looked normal. Until they looked closer. Because sometimes, the smallest detail matters the most. There were things missing. Not obvious things. Not valuables. But specific items. Personal items. Things that wouldn't mean anything to anyone else. But meant something to her. That changed the theory. Because now, it didn't look like she left suddenly. It looked like she planned something. Carefully. Deliberately. And that raised a new question. If she planned to leave, why did she make it look like she didn't? Why leave everything behind? Why disappear without a trace? It didn't add up. And the more investigators looked into her life, the more complicated things became. Because on the surface, she seemed normal. A routine life. Work. Home. Nothing unusual. But beneath that, there were gaps. Missing pieces. Parts of her past that didn't fully connect. Records that didn't match perfectly. Details that couldn't be confirmed. It was subtle, easy to miss. But once they saw it, they couldn't ignore it. Something about her identity wasn't completely real. That discovery changed everything. Because now, this wasn't just a missing person case. It was something else. Something bigger. Who was she, really? That question led investigators deeper. They started digging into her past, looking beyond the surface. And what they found raised even more questions. There were inconsistencies in her records. Small ones, different spellings, different dates. Nothing major on its own. But together, they told a different story. A story of someone who had been careful. Careful enough to build a life that looked real. But not careful enough to make it perfect. And that meant one thing. She was hiding something. Something important. Something worth disappearing for. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became. Her life before that town was a mystery. No clear history. No solid connections. Just fragments. And that's not normal. Because everyone has a past. But hers didn't exist. At least not in a way that could be proven. And that's when the case took a turn. Because now, investigators weren't just looking for a missing woman. They were looking for someone who might not even be who she claimed to be. Someone who had already disappeared once before, and might have done it again. Years passed. The case went cold. No new leads, no confirmed sightings, nothing. Eventually, the file was closed. Not solved, just inactive, because without evidence, there was nothing left to do. But cases like this don't really end. They wait, quietly, until something brings them back. And in this case, that moment came decades later, in a place no one expected, under a name no one recognized, living a life that didn't belong to her, because for 40 years, she hadn't just been hiding, she had been living a completely different identity, and no one knew, until one small mistake changed everything. She didn't just disappear, she became someone else, a new name, a new life, a new beginning, and for decades, it worked. In a quiet town far from where she vanished, a woman lived an ordinary life. Nothing about her stood out. She had a job, a routine, a place she called home. Neighbors knew her, co-workers trusted her. She blended in perfectly. That was the key, because the best way to hide is not to run, is to belong. And she understood that. She didn't draw attention, didn't make waves. She lived carefully, every move calculated, every detail controlled. Even the smallest things mattered. The way she introduced herself, the way she spoke about her past. Always consistent, always simple, no unnecessary details. Because the more you say, the more there is to question. And she couldn't afford that. For years, no one questioned anything. Why would they? She wasn't suspicious. She wasn't unusual. She was just there, part of the background. And over time, that's all she needed to be. Invisible in plain sight. But living a lie isn't easy. It requires constant attention, constant awareness. Because one mistake is all it takes. And for a long time, she didn't make one. She avoided official records whenever possible, kept things simple, paid in cash, moved carefully, stayed under the radar. But the world was changing. Systems became more connected, records more detailed. Things that didn't matter before started to matter. Identification, verification, proof. And that's where the cracks began. It started with something small, a routine situation, the kind of thing people do every day without thinking. But for her, it wasn't simple. She needed to confirm her identity, provide documentation. At first, it didn't seem like a problem. She had done it before, handled situations like this. But this time was different, because now, everything was connected. Records weren't isolated anymore. They were linked, cross-checked, verified, and that meant something dangerous. Her past could be seen, not fully, but enough to raise questions. The first sign came quietly, a delay, nothing dramatic, just a pause in the process, the kind that most people wouldn't notice. But she did, because she knew what it meant. Something didn't match, something wasn't right. The system flagged it, not as an error, but as something that needed review. And that was the problem, because review leads to attention, and attention leads to discovery. First, she tried to stay calm, told herself it was nothing, a simple mistake. But deep down, she knew better, because she had built her life on avoiding exactly this. And now, it was happening. Days passed. Then came the request. Additional verification. More documents. More information. More questions. Each one getting closer. Closer to something she couldn't explain. She responded carefully. Provided what she could. Avoided what she couldn't. But it wasn't enough. Because once a system starts looking, it doesn't stop. The inconsistencies grew. Small at first, then harder to ignore. Dates that didn't align, records that didn't exist, details that couldn't be confirmed. And suddenly, the identity she had built so carefully started to weaken. Meanwhile, on the other side, someone noticed, not her, but the system, a flag, a mismatch. It was passed along, reviewed, looked at again, and then compared to something else. An old record, a case that had been closed, but never solved. A woman who had disappeared decades ago. The details didn't match perfectly, but they were close. Close enough to matter. Close enough to ask one question. Could this be the same person? At first, it seemed unlikely. Too much time had passed. Too many variables. But the more they looked, the more it made sense. The timeline, the gaps, the missing history, it all pointed in one direction, and that direction led straight to her. The investigation reopened quietly, not officially at first, just a closer look, a comparison, because if they were wrong, it would mean nothing, but if they were right, it would change everything. Back in her quiet life, she could feel it, something shifting, something closing in, not in an obvious way, no sudden confrontations, no direct questions, just a feeling that something wasn't right, that something was coming, and for the first time in 40 years, she felt it again. Fear, not the kind that fades, the kind that stays, because she knew one thing: if they found out who she really was, everything would fall apart. Everything she had built, everything she had protected, gone. And all because of one small mistake. The system didn't forget, couldn't. Once something is flagged, it stays. What started as a small inconsistency was now something bigger, pattern, and patterns lead to questions. Investigators didn't rush. They moved carefully, because cases like this fall apart if handled too quickly. So they watched, quietly, reviewed records, cross-checked details, looked for anything that could confirm what they were beginning to suspect. And piece by piece, the truth started to form. The name she had been using for decades didn't fully exist, not in the way it should. There were records, yes, but they didn't go back far enough. There was no clear beginning, no solid origin, just a point where the identity seemed to appear, out of nowhere. That alone was unusual, but not impossible. What made it different was everything surrounding it: the missing history, the inconsistencies, the gaps that couldn't be explained. And the more they looked, the more one thing became clear: this wasn't a mistake. It was constructed, built, designed to look real, but only on the surface. And that meant something important. Whoever created it knew exactly what they were doing. Back in her quiet town, life continued as usual, at least on the outside. She went to work, spoke to neighbors, followed her routine. But inside, something had changed. That feeling, the one she hadn't felt in years, it was back, and it was getting stronger. Because even without knowing exactly what was happening, she could sense it, the pressure, the shift, like something was closing in. She became more careful, more aware, watching for anything unusual: car that stayed too long, a stranger asking questions, anything that didn't belong, because she knew how this worked. She had spent years avoiding it, and now felt like it was catching up. Meanwhile, investigators took the next step. They went back, not just a few years, but decades, to the original case, the woman who had disappeared. Her file was old, worn, but still there, still waiting. They compared everything: physical description, age, timeline, and slowly, the pieces began to match. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to make it real, enough to move forward. But they needed more, because suspicion isn't proof. And without proof, there is no case. So they dug deeper, looking for something solid, something undeniable, and eventually, they found it. A detail that had been overlooked before, small, almost insignificant, but now, it mattered. A connection between the past and the present. Something that tied the missing woman to the identity she was using now. It wasn't obvious, but it was there, hidden in plain sight, and once they saw it, everything clicked. This wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was real. They had found her. After 40 years, they had finally found her. Back in her home, she sat quietly, the room still, the air heavy, because now, she knew, not for certain, but enough to feel it, that something had changed, that the past she had buried was no longer buried. She thought about leaving, starting over again. It had worked once. Maybe it could work again, but something stopped her. Maybe it was time. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe, deep down, she knew it wouldn't work this time, because the world was different now. Harder to disappear, harder to hide, and the mistake she made couldn't be undone. Days later, the first real sign appeared. A knock, not loud, not aggressive, just deliberate. She froze, because in that moment, everything became real. All the years, all the lies, all the careful planning, it had all led to this. The knock came again, and this time, there was no doubt. They were here. The knock didn't stop. Not loud, not aggressive, just steady, certain. She stood there, frozen, because in that moment, there were only two choices. Open the door, or don't. But deep down, she already knew. It wouldn't matter, because after 40 years, there was nowhere left to run. Slowly, she moved, each step heavier than the last. The distance between her and the door felt longer than it should, like every second was stretching, like time itself didn't want this moment to happen. But it did. Her hand reached the handle, paused, and then she opened it. Two people stood outside, calm, professional, but there was something else in their presence. Finality. They didn't need to say much, because the look in their eyes said everything. They knew. For a moment, no one spoke, just silence, the kind that holds everything at once. And then, one simple question. Can we come in? It wasn't forceful. It didn't need to be, because this wasn't a request. It was the beginning of the end. She stepped aside, let them in, and just like that, the life she had built started to fall apart. They sat down, no rush, no pressure, because they didn't need it. Everything they needed was already there. Years of investigation, records, connections, all leading to this moment. First, she tried to hold on to it. The identity, the story, the life she had created. She answered carefully, gave the same responses she had given for decades. Simple, controlled. But this time, it didn't work, because now, they weren't asking questions to understand. They were asking questions they already knew the answers to. That's what broke it. Not pressure, not confrontation, certainty. They presented the details, the inconsistencies, the missing records, the connection to the past. The woman who had disappeared 40 years ago, her name, her life, and how it all led back to her. The silence that followed was different, heavier, because now there was nothing left to deny. The truth was sitting in the room, and it wasn't going anywhere. She looked down, not in fear, not in panic, but in something else. Recognition, like she had always known this moment would come, and now, finally had. The question came next. Simple, direct. Is that your real name? She didn't answer right away. Didn't need to, because the answer was already clear. But when she finally spoke, it wasn't complicated. It wasn't defensive. It was quiet. No, that single word changed everything. Because in that moment, the identity she had lived under for 40 years was gone. And what remained was the truth. The conversation shifted. No longer about who she was pretending to be, but who she really was, and what happened all those years ago. At first, the details came slowly, carefully, like pieces of a story she had kept locked away. But once they started, they didn't stop. She had left on purpose. Not suddenly, not impulsively, planned. She had prepared for it, saved what she needed, created what she didn't have, built a way out. And when the moment came, she took it. No goodbyes, no explanations, just gone. Because the life she was living back then wasn't one she wanted anymore. There were things she didn't want to face, things she didn't want to answer for. So she did the only thing she believed would work. She erased herself and started over. For years, it worked. She stayed hidden, stayed careful, built something new, something that felt safe. But safe doesn't mean permanent. And now, that truth was undeniable. The officers listened, not interrupting, not rushing, because this wasn't just a confession. It was the unraveling of 40 years. And every word brought them closer to the final piece. Why go through all of this? Why disappear completely? The answer wasn't dramatic. It wasn't shocking. It was quiet, almost ordinary. She didn't want to be who she was anymore. And in her mind, the only way to change that was to become someone else. Completely. But becoming someone else doesn't erase who you were. It just hides it. And eventually, the past catches up. When the conversation ended, there was nothing left to say, because everything had been exposed. Every detail, every lie, all of it. And now, there was only one thing left. Accountability. She stood up slowly, not resisting, not arguing, because she understood. After 40 years, this was inevitable. The moment she had avoided was finally here. By the time it was over, there was no mystery left, no hidden identity, no unanswered questions, just the truth and the weight of everything it carried. After 4 decades of silence, her past was no longer hers to control. It belonged to everyone now. Investigators closed the final gaps quickly. Every record, every timeline, every missing piece, all of it confirmed what they already knew. The woman who had lived quietly for 40 years was not who she claimed to be. She was the same person who had vanished decades ago. A life abandoned, past erased, and a story left unfinished. But what shocked people the most wasn't just that she disappeared. It was what she left behind. Because when she walked away, she didn't just leave a town. She left people, family, people who had spent years searching, wondering, waiting, not knowing if she was alive or gone forever. For them, the disappearance had never ended. It stayed with them, in unanswered questions, in empty spaces, in moments where her absence was impossible to ignore. Birthdays, holidays, every year that passed, without answers. And now, after 40 years, they finally had them. But answers don't always bring closure. Sometimes, they bring something else. Because learning the truth meant facing something difficult. She didn't disappear because she had to. She disappeared because she chose to. That realization hit harder than anything else. Because it changed everything. It wasn't a tragedy. It wasn't something that happened to her. It was something she did. And that made it harder to accept, harder to understand. When they were told she was alive, the reaction wasn't simple. It wasn't just relief. It was complicated. Because after so many years, the idea of her had changed. Memories had filled the gaps. Stories had replaced the unknown. And now, the truth didn't match any of it. She hadn't been lost. She had been hiding, living a different life, moving forward, while they stayed behind. That's what made it hurt. Because time doesn't stop for everyone. And while she built something new, they were left with what she abandoned. When the moment finally came, when they had the chance to face her, there were no easy words, no clear emotions, just silence. Because what do you say to someone who chose to disappear from your life? There's no script for that, no right way to respond, only questions. And even those don't always have answers. She didn't try to justify it, didn't offer excuses, because some actions don't have explanations that make them right. All she could do was tell the truth, and the truth was simple. She wanted a different life, and she took it, no matter the cost, no matter who it affected. For 40 years, she lived with that decision, carried it quietly, built something around it. But in the end, none of it erased what she had done. Because the past doesn't disappear. It waits, and eventually comes back. For her, it came back with a knock on the door. For everyone else, It came back as the answer they had been waiting for, an answer that changed everything. Because now, there was no more wondering, no more searching, just the truth, and the understanding that some things can't be undone. In the end, her story wasn't about escape. It wasn't about getting away, because she didn't. Not really. She only delayed the moment when everything would catch up. And when it did, there was no running, no hiding, no second chance, just reality.